In the cold corners of a forgotten American town, where snow often fell heavier than hope, there lived a little black boy named Micah. He was only 9 years old, and though his body was thin and his clothes were torn, his spirit was whole. Micah came from Africa when he was just a baby. His parents had vanished in a storm no one ever explained. And since then, he belonged to no one. The orphanage where Micah stayed was a crumbling place. Walls were cracked, windows broken, and silence, louder than any voice. The other children played, laughed, and sometimes cried, but Micah did not. He watched the sky. He watched the stars. He waited. Every night, after the other children slept, Micah would kneel beside the narrow bed with a thin mattress. He folded his tiny hands, closed his tired eyes, and whispered his heart to Allah. He never asked for toys, or warm meals, or warm shoes. He asked for something no one could wrap in paper. He asked for a family, a real one. A mother who would brush his hair. A father who would carry him when he was tired. A home that smelled like love. Micah's prayers were not loud. They floated up gently, like a feather in the wind. The caretakers never heard them. The world never saw them. But every night, Micah believed someone did. Somewhere. One evening, when the snow fell like salt from heaven, Micah was outside alone. His bare hands touched the frozen ground. He was not building a snowman. He was writing names in the snow. Names he imagined for his mother and father. Names he thought sounded warm. And far away, behind a tall black gate across the street, stood a man. He was dressed in an old gray coat. His face was carved with years of silence, and his eyes held stories buried deep. The man did not speak. He never did. He only watched, quietly, like the wind that passed by without permission. He watched Micah every evening. He never came closer, never waved, never smiled. But his hands would tremble slightly each time the boy dropped to his knees in the snow. Something inside him ached, yet he remained still like a statue haunted by time. Micah never saw him, not really. Maybe once, in the corner of his eye. But the boy was always too busy hoping. The man in gray never missed a night. One night Micah stayed outside longer. Too long. The wind grew cruel. His lips turned blue, but he kept praying. The snow soaked through his sleeves. His breath came out in short clouds. Still, he kept whispering. And across the street, the silent man stepped forward. Just once. Then he stopped and turned away. But something had changed. Something had started. Micah did not know that his prayer had finally touched something beyond. The sky. It had touched a soul that had forgotten how to feel. And that night, for the first time in years, the silent man looked up to the stars and closed his eyes. He remembered something. But what he remembered was not peace. It was pain. And pain always leads somewhere. To be continued. In the cold corners of a forgotten American town, where snow often fell heavier than hope, there lived a little black boy named Micah. He was only 9 years old, and though his body was thin and his clothes were torn, his spirit was whole. Micah came from Africa when he was just a baby. His parents had vanished in a storm no one ever explained. And since then, he belonged to no one. The orphanage where Micah stayed was a crumbling place. Walls were cracked, windows broken, and silence louder than any voice. The other children played, laughed, and sometimes cried, but Micah did not. He watched the sky. He watched the stars. He waited. Every night, after the other children slept, Micah would kneel beside the narrow bed with a thin mattress. He folded his tiny hands, closed his tired eyes, and whispered his heart to Allah. He never asked for toys, or warm meals, or warm shoes. He asked for something no one could wrap in paper. He asked for a family, a real one. A mother who would brush his hair. A father who would carry him when he was tired. A home that smelled like love. Micah's prayers were not loud. They floated up gently, like a feather in the wind. The caretakers never heard them. The world never saw them. But every night, Micah believed someone did. Somewhere. One evening, when the snow fell like salt from heaven, Micah was outside alone. His bare hands touched the frozen ground. He was not building a snowman. He was writing names in the snow. Names he imagined for his mother and father. Names he thought sounded warm. And far away, behind a tall black gate across the street, stood a man. He was dressed in an old gray coat. His face was carved with years of silence, and his eyes held stories buried deep. The man did not speak. He never did. He only watched, quietly, like the wind that passed by without permission. He watched Micah every evening. He never came closer, never waved, never smiled. But his hands would tremble slightly each time the boy dropped to his knees in the snow. Something inside him ached, yet he remained still like a statue haunted by time. Micah never saw him, not really. Maybe once, in the corner of his eye. But the boy was always too busy hoping. The man in gray never missed a night. One night Micah stayed outside longer. Too long. The wind grew cruel. His lips turned blue, but he kept praying. The snow soaked through his sleeves. His breath came out in short clouds. Still, he kept whispering. And across the street, the silent man stepped forward. Just once. Then he stopped and turned away. But something had changed. Something had started. Micah did not know that his prayer had finally touched something beyond. The sky. It had touched a soul that had forgotten how to feel. And that night, for the first time in years, the silent man looked up to the stars and closed his eyes. He remembered something. But what he remembered was not peace. It was pain. And pain always leads somewhere. To be continued. The snowstorm had passed, but the chill stayed. Inside the orphanage, the walls moaned from the cold, and the roof leaked where the rain had turned to ice. Micah sat by the window, watching the empty street outside. The caretaker said nothing about his soaked clothes or frozen fingers. He had fallen asleep on the floor the night before, still whispering his prayer. Across the street, behind the iron gate that never opened, the silent man sat alone. His name was never spoken in the town, and no one remembered when he had arrived. The neighbors called him a ghost. Some said he was rich once. Others believed he had lost someone and locked himself away. But none of them knew the truth. None of them saw the way his eyes followed the boy each night, with something deeper than sorrow. It was a wound. Inside his house, dust covered the furniture. Photos were turned face down on shelves. A fireplace that once warmed the room had not burned in years. But now, in the corner of his living room, sat a small drawing, a boy kneeling under the stars, carved carefully into a piece of wood. The man had carved it the night he saw Micah kneel in the snow. He hadn't touched wood in decades. His hands used to make beautiful things: doors, tables, cribs. He once built a crib for a child that never arrived. Now he carved in silence, remembering hands he once held, and a promise he never fulfilled. Each night after that, he returned to the window, watching Micah with growing unrest. The boy didn't beg. He didn't complain. He simply waited, as if he knew something was coming, as if he believed someone, somewhere, had heard him. The man began leaving food on the sidewalk just outside the gate. Nothing obvious. A loaf of bread, a pair of gloves. Once, a scarf wrapped in newspaper. Micah never questioned where they came from. He only smiled at the sky and whispered thank you. He thought it was from all but each time Micah picked something up and smiled, the man behind the curtains felt something sharp in his chest. He hadn't smiled back yet. Not once. He was afraid if he did, something inside him would break. Then one night something did. Micah had been coughing. A deep, dry sound that echoed across the yard. His coat was too thin, and his shoes had holes. In the solace, He tried to play with the others, but his body trembled. He had fever in his eyes, but still, he knelt to pray before bed. That night, the man didn't go to the window. He went to the basement. He opened a box he had buried in dust. And silence. Inside it were old letters, a baby blanket, and a picture of a young woman with a kind smile. He held the blanket in his shaking hands, and for the first time in 20 years, the silent man cried. He cried for what he lost. He cried for the child that was never born. And then, he did something no one expected. He unlocked the gate. The lock hadn't moved in so long. It screeched as if in pain, but he did not step out, not yet. Instead, he placed something outside the gate, a box. Inside it, medicine, warm socks, and a wooden carving of a star. He hoped the boy would find it, but as he turned away, he did not see what was standing behind him. A shadow from his past. Watching. Waiting. And it was not the boy. To be continued. The box lay outside the gate, just beyond the snow-covered path. Micah found it at dawn. He was weaker now, coughing more often, his steps slower. But when he saw the box, something lit up inside him. Not curiosity, not greed, just quiet gratitude. He opened it with trembling fingers. The socks were thick and soft, warmer than anything he had ever worn. The medicine had no label, but he took it with trust, believing it was sent by Allah. And the wooden star, smooth and carefully carved, he held it against his chest like a treasure. He didn't know who had sent it, but it felt like a promise. Back across the street, the man watched from behind the curtain. His heart ached with each breath the boy took. He had never wanted to feel this again, but now the feelings came like a flood. Each glance at Micah peeled away the walls he had built around himself. The boy reminded him of something. No, not something. Someone. Years ago, there had been a woman. Her name was never spoken anymore. She had eyes full of kindness and a voice that brought peace to broken places. She had carried their child for 7 months before tragedy struck. A car crash. One moment she was alive, the next gone. And with her, the child he never got to hold. He had blamed himself. He had stopped speaking. He had locked the gates and shut the world out. Until now. But while the man opened his heart again, the shadow from his past had returned. A woman stood behind the iron trees that lined the street. Her coat was long, her face hidden behind dark glasses. No one had seen her arrive. No one knew her name, but she knew the man. She had once worked for his family. Long ago. Before everything fell apart, she watched Micah, too, but not with kindness. She saw something in the boy that unsettled her. That morning, she followed him quietly as he walked behind the orphanage, cradling the wooden star. She stayed far enough to avoid being seen, but close enough to study him. The way he moved, the way he looked up at the sky before every step. She wrote something in her notebook. That night, she visited the man's gate. She didn't knock. She simply left a letter, tucked under the latch. No name, no return address. Only 5 words written in thick ink. Does the boy know yet? The man found the letter at dawn. His hands froze. His chest tightened. He read it again and again. It was a message he never wanted to read. It meant someone else knew. Someone else remembered. And someone else was watching the boy that evening. He didn't go to the window. He crossed the street. For the first time in years, his feet touched the sidewalk outside his gate, and he walked slowly toward the orphanage. But behind him, deep in the trees, the woman watched. And this time, she was not alone. To be continued. The man's steps were heavy, each footfall breaking through the frost that blanketed the sidewalk. His long coat moved gently in the wind, but he didn't feel the cold. His mind was somewhere else, buried in memories he had fought to forget. He hadn't stepped outside his gate in nearly 20 years. And now, as he stood in front of the orphanage, everything around him felt fragile, as if the past might come crashing down with one wrong breath. Micah was inside, wrapped in a blanket, too thin for the freezing night. He held the wooden star close to his chest, his breath shallow, his skin pale. The medicine had helped, but not enough. The fever was stronger now. Still, even in his weakness, Micah's eyes remained full of hope. His lips moved silently, forming the same prayer he whispered every night. Outside, the man didn't knock. He stood still for a long time, staring at the crumbling building. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out another carving, a small bird, wings spread wide, carved from dark wood. He placed it gently on the orphanage steps and turned away. He wasn't ready to face what waited behind the door, but the woman. In the shadows was Ready Dot. She watched him from across the street, hidden beneath the hood of her coat. Her notebook was now filled with sketches, words, and maps. Her hands trembled not from the cold, but from the truth she had uncovered. Micah was not just a boy praying for a family. He was connected to something bigger, something she had buried. Years ago, along with her loyalty to the man who now walked the streets again, she had worked for his family once. She knew what had happened in the past. She knew the name of the woman who died. And she knew about the child who was never supposed to survive. But now that child was alive, in the form of a boy with skin like midnight and eyes full of stars. A boy named Micah. The record said he came from Africa. But records can lie. And now, someone else knew the truth. The man returned to his house. He sat in the dark, holding the letter that had shaken him to the core. Does the boy know yet? Those words echoed in his mind like a storm. He lit a fire for the first time in years, not to warm the room, but to burn the past. Page by page, he dropped old letters into the flames. Pages that spoke of grief, adoption, denial, and silence. But there was one letter he did not burn. A letter written by his late wife, her last words, words he had never opened. He stared at the envelope with shaking hands. He finally tore it open. And read. As the fire flickered beside him, the truth unraveled in a single paragraph, and when he reached the final line, his breath caught. If you ever find him, you will know by his prayer. The letter fell from his fingers. He knew now he had found him, but someone else had too. And they were coming. To be continued. Morning came with silence heavier than snow. The sky was gray, and the wind moved slowly, as if time itself had paused. Micah stayed in bed that day. His fever had grown worse. His lips were dry, his body limp, but his hand never let go of the wooden star. He had no words left to speak, but in his silence, he still prayed. At the same time, the man in the gray coat sat alone beside the fire, staring at the letter from his wife. Her handwriting was soft, almost fading, but her final words burned, brighter than the flames beside him. If you ever find him, you will know by his prayer. All these years he thought the child had never survived, that there was nothing left. But now Micah's face appeared in every memory, the way he knelt, the way he whispered, the way he looked up at the sky, not with sadness, but with faith. He had seen that same look in his wife's eyes. Micah was not a stranger, he was his son. The man stood, slowly, his legs shook under the weight of truth. He gathered his coat, took the last carving, this one shaped like a heart, and stepped out into the cold. He was not going to leave another prayer unanswered. But across the street, the woman had already moved. She had entered the orphanage through a side door, unnoticed by the caretakers. She moved like a shadow, silent and precise. She had come for Micah, not to hurt him, but to stop what was about to happen, to keep the truth buried. Because the truth would destroy more than just silence. It would reveal her part in the lie, Years ago, she had taken the child from the hospital without anyone's knowledge. She was told he had died, but she saw him breathing. She couldn't let him stay. Not with the man who had already lost too much. So she sent the baby away across the ocean, through hidden papers, false names, sealed records. She thought the boy would disappear into the world, never to be seen again, but fate had other plans. Now she stood over his bed, watching him sleep. His skin was warm with fever, his breath shallow. And in his hand, the star. She reached out to take it, perhaps to erase the trace of the man's presence. But the moment her fingers touched the wood, Micah stirred. He didn't open his eyes. He only whispered, barely audible, yet unmistakable. "Thank you, Allah." The woman froze. That was the prayer. The same words, the same voice. She stepped back, her hand trembling. Her chest tightened with guilt. And then, from behind her, a voice cut through the silence, not spoken aloud, but carried in footsteps that filled the room with memory. The man had arrived. He stood in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the one with memory. The man had arrived. Woman. Not in anger, but in recognition. She turned slowly. Their eyes met. And in that moment, the past stood between them. Unspoken. Unforgiven. Micah slept on, unaware of the storm gathering beside him. But outside, the wind had changed. And somewhere beneath the silence, destiny was breathing again. To be continued. The room stood still. The air was thick with everything that had never been said. The man took a step forward. His eyes never left the woman who had once worked in his home, once held his trust, and then vanished without a word. Her hands remained at her sides, trembling, but she did not speak. She knew he did not need words. His eyes moved past her to the bed. To the boy. To Micah. Micah's body was small beneath the blanket. His face was pale, but in his fingers, still clutched tightly, was the star. The carving that confirmed what the man already knew, but still couldn't believe. This was his son. Not by accident. Not by hope. But by blood. The man sat beside the bed. He did not cry. He did not speak. He only looked at Micah with the kind of gaze that carries the weight of lifetimes. Slowly, he reached into his coat and placed the last carving, the one shaped like a heart, beside the boy's hand. Then he turned back to the woman, his jaw clenched. But he still did not speak. She pulled a folded paper from her coat. It was old, worn, but still intact. A birth certificate. Micah single quotes S. But the name written at the bottom was his own. The man took it. His hands shook. He stared at the signature. He didn't remember writing, because he never had. She had forged it. She had tried to make it disappear. And now, even she could no longer explain why. Perhaps it had been fear, perhaps guilt, or a twisted attempt at protection. But it no longer mattered. Because the truth had survived. Through prayers, through carvings, through silence. Micah stirred again. A cough escaped him, weak, then another. The fever was stronger now. His body was fighting. But it was growing tired. The man stood. Left the room, and for the first time, he raised his voice, not in anger, but in command. He demanded a doctor. He demanded help. The orphanage had never seen him before. To them, he was a myth, a ghost. But now he moved through their halls like a storm breaking through years of stillness. The woman followed him, her face hollow, her steps uncertain. But it was too late to stop the truth. He had already called. The ambulance arrived. Before the sun had set, Micah was lifted gently from the bed, wrapped in blankets, placed on a stretcher, still clutching the wooden star, still breathing, but barely. As the doors closed, the man stepped inside. With him, he did not look back. Not at the orphanage. Not at the woman. Not at the past. Only forward. And as the ambulance pulled away, the snow began to fall again. covering the footsteps, covering the lies. But the fire inside him, what the years had failed to burn, was burning again. He would not lose his son. Not this time. To be continued. The ambulance cut through the quiet streets, red lights flashing against the pale snow. Inside, the boy lay still, his forehead beaded with sweat. Machines beeped softly beside him. Tubes delivered air and medicine into his fragile body. But Micah held on, not to fear, not to pain, but to the wooden star that never left his hand. Beside him sat the man, his father. He had not spoken a word, not even to the paramedics. But his hand gripped Micah's gently, as if to pour every year of silence into that touch. The carver who once lived in shadows now sat in the light of truth. The fire he had rekindled in his home had not just warmed a room. It had awakened a purpose. At the hospital, the boy was rushed into a room filled with white coats and voices too quick to understand. The man waited in the hallway. Alone again, but not in the same way. This time, he waited not for death to pass, but for life to return. The hours crawled by. He sat on a bench with his coat still on. The same coat he had worn for 20 years. Inside its pocket were scraps of wood, a folded letter, and the carving shaped like a heart, now empty from the spot where he had placed it beside his son. He stared through the glass window, where Micah lay asleep, wrapped in wires and blankets, but his hand still clutched the star. The boy had not let go, even in sleep, even in pain. He held on to hope. Doctors moved around the room. Nurses checked machines. And slowly, hour by hour, Micah's chest began to rise more evenly. The color returned to his lips. The fever began to break. He was fighting. And winning. When morning came, the doctor stepped out with a nod. The worst was over. The boy would live. The man didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply closed his eyes and whispered a prayer of his own. Not with words, but with silence. The same kind Micah had offered for years. Now it was his turn. 3 days later, Micah awoke fully. His eyes fluttered open to see sunlight pouring through the hospital window. He turned his head slowly and saw him, the man in the gray coat, sitting by his side, holding a new carving, a home, with a door slightly open. Micah's hand reached. For no words were spoken. None were needed. Because Micah had prayed for a family. And the answer had come. Not with thunder. With signs. But with footsteps in the snow. With a stranger who had always been waiting. With a silence that finally spoke. And as the two sat there, side by side, the wind outside moved softly across the window, carrying no more sorrow, only peace.